Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all having a good day today. Before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps more than you might think. No one should have to endure what Meri Brown has lived through for decades on Sister Wives. And yet, season after season, viewers have watched her quietly absorb rejection, emotional distance, and repeated demotion within her own family. Time and again, her pain was brushed aside, sometimes directly, sometimes subtly, as if it mattered less than everyone else's. From the very beginning, Meri was placed in a painful contradiction. She was both the foundation of the Brown family and, somehow, the most disposable piece of it. Meri was the first wife. She helped build the family structure alongside Kody Brown, welcoming additional wives into the marriage, believing in the shared vision they all talked about. But as the family grew and shifted, she slowly found herself pushed to the margins of her own life. What was once a marriage became little more than a title. Affection faded, closeness disappeared. Emotional connection became something she remembered rather than experienced. And still, expectations of loyalty, sacrifice, and silence remained firmly in place. It's a dynamic many viewers now recognize as deeply unfair and emotionally punishing. Meri's journey isn't just about a plural marriage that didn't work. It's about the slow erosion of self-worth that happens when someone is constantly told they're the problem, while their needs are minimized or ignored. For years, she stayed. She hoped things would change. She believed promises. She held on to the idea that endurance itself was a virtue. And all the while, Kody openly admitted he had no romantic feelings for her, said he felt no emotional connection, and treated her more like an obligation than a partner. Right there on camera, with the whole world watching. What makes Meri's story especially heartbreaking is how she was often labeled as distant or cold. In reality, what we were seeing was a woman who had been emotionally starved for years. She was blamed, sidelined, and expected to fix problems that were never hers alone to solve. Instead of compassion, she faced criticism. Instead of understanding, she was accused of negativity and told to change herself to save a marriage she couldn't carry by herself. Then came the infamous catfishing incident, which only cemented this unfair narrative. Meri was turned into a cautionary tale for the family, but looking back now, many viewers see it differently. Not as betrayal, but as a desperate cry for connection from someone who had already been emotionally abandoned long before anyone else entered the picture. Rather than receiving empathy, she was shamed, pushed further out, and forced to carry that mistake forever. Meanwhile, Kody's emotional withdrawal was excused or normalized, as if it were just part of the arrangement. Through all of this, Meri remained financially responsible. She showed up emotionally when asked. She stayed committed to the family structure, even as she lived alone, spent holidays on the outskirts, and watched Kody prioritize Robyn and her children in ways that made the imbalance impossible to ignore. Still, she stayed, partly out of faith, partly out of loyalty, and partly because leaving meant admitting that decades of sacrifice had not earned her the love, security, or respect she was promised. Viewers watched Meri show up to family gatherings where she seemed slightly guarded, only to have her opinions brushed aside or ignored. They saw her sit through confessionals, where Kody bluntly said he didn't consider himself married to her anymore. That kind of public rejection is something no one should ever have to endure, especially not over and over again, and certainly not from a spouse who once promised a lifetime commitment. What's especially striking is how often Meri was expected to quietly swallow her pain. She was told, directly and indirectly, to be grateful for small scraps of inclusion and to support the very system that kept pushing her out. Even as Christine and Janelle eventually found the strength to walk away and reclaim their independence, Meri remained stuck in place, caught between who she truly was and who she had been taught she was supposed to be. She had been raised to believe that endurance was a mark of faith, that suffering was something to be borne quietly as a spiritual test. That inner conflict is what makes her story so painful. Endurance without relief eventually becomes emotional captivity. Over time, it stops being about strength and starts being about survival. When Meri finally began carving out independence through her business ventures, travel, and personal pursuits, it became clear she was rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried for years. Yet even these small steps towards self-worth were sometimes labeled as selfish or disloyal by the family, reinforcing an impossible standard. Be independent, but not distant. Speak up, but not too much. Be strong, but never threatening. As the years went on, it became increasingly clear that Meri's suffering wasn't accidental. It was built into the family structure itself. Compliance was rewarded. Emotional honesty was punished. And while the other wives eventually reached visible breaking points that made leaving unavoidable, Meri's breaking point was quieter and slower, happening internally. That made it easier for others to miss just how much she was hurting. Many viewers who once judged her harshly now look back with regret, realizing that Meri was grieving the loss of her marriage long before it officially ended. She was mourning a future that had been promised but never delivered, and she did so largely alone, without the validation or support that might have helped her heal sooner. No one should stay in a relationship where they are openly unwanted. No one should be told, again and again, that reconciliation is impossible, yet still be expected to remain loyal and married. And no one should be asked to carry the emotional labor of a family that refuses to meet them halfway. Yet, that was Meri Brown's reality for far too long. Her story serves as a cautionary reminder of the cost of placing obligation above personal well-being. As Sister Wives moves forward and the Brown family continues to unravel, Meri's quiet resilience stands out, not as weakness, but as survival. She may not have left with dramatic speeches or visible anger, but her journey is no less powerful. Reclaiming your life after years of being diminished takes real courage. In the end, Meri Brown's story isn't just about plural marriage or reality television. It's about what happens when someone is asked to set aside their own happiness indefinitely for the sake of others. And the truth, sadly, is very simple. No one should have to endure what Meri Brown endured. The fact that she carried this burden for so many years should invite empathy, honest reflection, and a deeper look at the emotional risks hidden behind the polished image of family unity that Sister Wives once promised. What makes Meri's experience even more damaging is how consistently her pain was minimized, not just by Kody, but by the family culture that formed around him. It was a culture that quietly taught everyone involved, including the audience, that Meri's loneliness was simply something she should accept, that her desire for affection was unreasonable, that her grief over losing her marriage was inconvenient rather than a genuine emotional wound. This normalization of her suffering became one of the most unsettling aspects of Sister Wives, because it showed how easily a person's humanity can be pushed aside in the name of belief systems and favoritism. Meri was expected to celebrate other marriages that were thriving while her own was falling apart. She was asked to smile through milestones that only reminded her of what she had lost. And when she struggled with jealousy, sadness, or resentment, those emotions were framed as moral failings instead of natural human reactions. Over time, this messaging wore her down. It weakened her ability to stand up for herself and trained her to blame herself for circumstances she did not create. When Kody began rewriting the history of their relationship, claiming they were never compatible or that the problems were entirely Meri's fault, it functioned as a form of emotional gaslighting. It left her questioning her own memories and feelings. And as viewers now recognize, this became especially troubling when paired with his refusal to offer comfort, reconciliation, or even basic emotional kindness. Still, Meri stayed, connected to the family by appearances and expectations rather than love. Her isolation became most visible during holidays and family gatherings, where she was often physically present but emotionally shut out. Her role had quietly shifted into something painful and undefined, not truly a wife, but not free either. That in-between state may have been the cruelest part of all, because it denied her both belonging and closure. The arrival of Robyn only deepened this imbalance. Kody's emotional, legal, and practical focus shifted clearly and decisively. leaving Meri to watch another woman receive the partnership, protection, and affection she once believed were lifelong promises. And while Robyn often spoke about caring for Meri, what played out on screen told a different story. One where Meri's needs consistently came second to preserving Kody's comfort and Robyn's stability. When Meri finally spoke up, admitting she felt forgotten or unwanted, her honesty was often met with defensiveness, deflection, or vague spiritual language that offered no real solution. The message remained clear. Endurance was expected, happiness was not. That expectation trapped Meri in a painful cycle. Leaving felt like failure, but staying meant continued emotional harm. For years, viewers watched her wrestle with this contradiction. Her expressions showed frustration, confusion, and quiet despair, while her words stayed careful and restrained, as if she feared that showing too much pain would only push her further away. And that's why Meri's story resonates so deeply, because it reflects the experience of countless people who remain in emotionally empty relationships out of duty, fear, faith, or hope, waiting far too long for something that never truly arrives. Believing that suffering is simply the price of loyalty, Sister Wives unintentionally became a case study in what long-term emotional neglect can do to a person. Over time, it can hollow someone out, draining joy from everyday life and replacing it with a constant state of survival. Meri's emotional awakening didn't arrive with dramatic speeches or explosive moments. Instead, it showed up quietly, through small but meaningful changes, choosing to invest in herself, traveling, building a life and identity outside the family, and finally stopping the exhausting search for validation from someone who had made it clear he was never going to give it. On the surface, these steps may have seemed minor. In reality, they represented a radical break from the role Meri had been assigned for decades. And yet, even as she grew stronger, the family narrative continued to frame her independence as abandonment. A painful irony, considering how thoroughly she had been emotionally abandoned long before she ever began to step back. When Christine left, many celebrated her fiery resolve. When Janelle followed, her calm clarity was praised. But Meri's departure unfolded slowly, almost sorrowfully, as though she needed time to grieve not only the marriage itself, but the version of herself that believed enduring pain was somehow noble. That quiet exit says a great deal about how deeply rooted her conditioning was, and how difficult it is to unlearn the belief that a person's worth is measured by how much suffering they can tolerate. Meri's resilience, so often mistaken for passivity, was actually a survival strategy shaped in an environment where asserting needs led to withdrawal or punishment. Understanding that changes how we see her entire journey. It transforms her from a divisive figure into one of the most complex and quietly tragic individuals on the show. As viewers revisit earlier seasons with fresh eyes, moments that once seemed small now feel heavy with meaning. Meri sitting alone, Meri forcing a polite smile, Meri defending a family that no longer defended her. Together, these moments tell a story of emotional endurance no one should be asked to carry, especially not for decades. The real tragedy isn't that Meri stayed too long. It's that she was given so many reasons to believe she deserved less. And yet, despite everything, she has emerged with a sense of self that feels hard-earned and deeply human. Her story reminds us that healing doesn't always look dramatic. Reclaiming your life can be slow, uneven, and filled with doubt and grief, but it can still be profoundly transformative. Meri Brown's journey forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What is the true cost of loyalty? What happens when pain is silenced in the name of harmony? And how easily does emotional neglect become normalized when power goes unchecked? While Sister Wives may have begun as an exploration of plural marriage, it has evolved into something far more revealing. A long, unfiltered look at what happens when one person's needs are consistently pushed aside until endurance becomes their identity. No one should ever have to prove their worth by suffering in silence. No one should ever be made to feel disposable within their own marriage. And no one should be asked to stay forever in the hope of love that has already been taken away. Meri Brown's story stands as a powerful reminder of these truths, urging viewers to reflect on how easily empathy can be withheld when someone else's pain becomes inconvenient, and how meaningful it is when a person finally chooses themselves after years of being taught not to. What lingers most painfully about Meri's journey isn't just what happened to her, but how long it took for anyone, inside or outside the family, to truly acknowledge that what she was enduring was not normal, not healthy, and not acceptable. For years, the narrative surrounding Meri quietly suggested that her suffering was either self-inflicted or spiritually necessary. That framing stripped her pain of urgency and allowed it to continue unchecked. That message was reinforced again and again. Every time Kody dismissed her feelings as emotional baggage. Every time reconciliation was dangled and then pulled away. Every time Meri was told, directly or indirectly, that emotional fulfillment was no longer possible. Yet, she was still expected to remain loyal and present. The cruelty of this arrangement cannot be overstated. It asked her to stay committed to a marriage that no longer existed, while denying her the freedom to grieve it properly or move on. She was trapped in an emotional limbo where hope was discouraged, but leaving was treated like betrayal. This contradiction became the defining pressure of Meri's life for years. It slowly wore down her sense of agency and left her questioning whether her desire for love and connection was selfish in the first place. When she tried to express her loneliness, her honesty was often met with discomfort or irritation, as if acknowledging her pain threatened the stability of a system that depended on her silence. Over time, she learned to shrink herself. She laughed things off. She accepted isolation as the price of belonging. She internalized the idea that wanting more made her weak. Viewers saw this play out in subtle but telling ways. Meri doubting her own feelings. Meri apologizing for being hurt. Meri returning again and again to conversations that offered no solutions, only reminders of what would never change. That slow erosion of hope may be one of the most damaging parts of her story, because it shows how emotional neglect can be just as harmful as overt abuse. As the family continued to fracture and alliances became clearer, Meri found herself increasingly alone. Her role shifted from being a living partner to a symbolic link to the family's past rather than an active part of its present. While others moved on to new lives, new relationships, and new identities, Meri remained tied to a version of herself shaped by endurance, still questioning whether staying was loyalty or simply habit. The fact that all of this unfolded on television adds another layer of tragedy. Meri's most vulnerable moments, her confusion, her heartbreak, her quiet attempts to matter, were recorded and consumed as entertainment, often without the empathy they deserved. Only in hindsight have many viewers begun to recognize the emotional cost of watching someone be slowly diminished season after season. Meri's experience also exposes the unspoken expectations baked into the family's belief system. Women were taught to value harmony over happiness, to absorb discomfort for the greater good, and to place personal fulfillment second to group stability. In that environment, Meri's pain wasn't just allowed, it was normalized, treated as an unfortunate but acceptable consequence of plural marriage, rather than a clear signal that something was deeply wrong. When Kody openly admitted that he felt no obligation to even try anymore, it should have been a moment of clarity and perhaps freedom for Meri. Instead, it became just another emotional dead end. Because clarity without compassion still wounds, and release without support can feel almost the same as abandonment. The years Meri spent trapped in this emotional, no man's land robbed her of opportunities. Opportunities to love freely, to be chosen, to rebuild her life sooner. And while she has since begun reclaiming her independence, those lost years remain a quiet cost beneath her newfound freedom. They stand as a reminder of how much she poured into a marriage that ultimately gave her nothing back. What makes Meri's awakening so meaningful is that it wasn't driven by anger or revenge. It came from exhaustion, from the slow realization that staying and waiting for validation from someone who had already emotionally walked away was harming her more than leaving ever could. Painful as it was, that realization marked the beginning of a gentler relationship with herself, one rooted more in choice than obligation. As Meri stepped into this new chapter, something else became clear. Her demeanor changed. We began to see a woman capable of warmth, humor, and genuine connection, qualities that had always been there, but had been buried under years of emotional neglect. This transformation forces a rethinking of how she was portrayed and perceived, challenging us to ask how often we mistake survival behaviors for personality traits. Meri's story also raises difficult questions about responsibility, especially Kody's refusal to acknowledge the harm caused by years of rejection. Neglect can be just as damaging as outright cruelty. Choosing not to engage, not to try, and not to care carries consequences that can't be erased by spiritual explanations or rewritten history. The emotional impact of Meri's experience will likely linger long after the cameras stop rolling. Healing from years of neglect is rarely straightforward. Even as she builds a fuller, more independent life, the imprint of being unwanted by someone who once promised forever doesn't disappear overnight. And yet, within that pain lies a quiet resilience, one that deserves recognition and respect. Surviving something does not mean it was acceptable. And Meri's ability to endure does not excuse the people or the system that benefited from her silence. That distinction matters because too often we praise strength in a way that ends up justifying suffering instead of preventing it. When we step back and reflect on Meri Brown's journey, it becomes clear that her story is about far more than one woman's experience on Sister Wives. It holds up a mirror to the emotional cost of systems that place belief above individuality, loyalty above love, and silence above honesty. The show once presented plural marriage as a path to shared fulfillment, but Meri's experience exposes the darker reality of what happens when one person's needs are consistently pushed aside until they almost disappear. No one should have to wait years just to feel seen. No one should have to earn love by enduring pain. And no one should be made to believe that their loneliness is a personal flaw rather than a sign of a broken relationship. Meri Brown's story brings these truths into sharp focus, serving as both a warning and a testament to the human capacity to survive even the most isolating circumstances. As viewers continue to re-examine Sister Wives with a more critical eye, Meri's journey stands out, not because it was the loudest or most dramatic, but because it was the quietest and, in many ways, the most devastating. It was a slow unraveling that happened in plain sight, a reminder that the deepest wounds are often the ones inflicted without spectacle. And most importantly, it reminds us that no one, absolutely no one, should ever have to endure what Meri Brown endured just to prove their worth.